I grew up in Spokane, Washington. I had a wonderful, wonderful piano teacher there, Margaret Saunders Ott, who was, came from all the best pedigrees, studied with Olga Samarov and at Juilliard, one of Stokowski's wives, and was deeply embedded in the classical piano, the standard piano tradition, and was also a fantastic person, open and inspiring, and very caring, very committed teacher. And she would leave. We would go to her house and sit in her wonderful living room waiting for the lesson in the studio, which was was closed doors from the living room, which could open for masterclass performances. And she would always leave a book out that she just happened to be reading recently, as we would come through just to peruse. And one week I got there, and there was a book called 20th Century Music by Peter Yates. And I was in probably 7th grade at the time, and I just flipped it open to one of the earlier pages, and there was a indented paragraph, which started out describing, I can almost remember it exactly, the famous, these are the words in Peter Yates' words in the book, the famous, or some might say infamous, work of John Cage, 4 minutes 33 seconds, and in quotes, the Silent Sonata, in which a pianist at the instrument or several players at their instruments sit for 4.5 minutes and produce no sound. And that just, blew my mind. I'd never heard of this before. By now, most people have heard of Cage's silent work, but this was in, 1960 something. And I borrowed the book from her, took it home, and read every page of it, and got introduced to the works of Cage and Schoenberg and Charles Ives and Karl-Heinz Stockhaus and Harry Partch and the whole new music scene, up and the first half of the 20th century, and it had a very particular emphasis on the American experimental scene. Cage, Feldman, Lou Harris, and Charles Ives, of course, is the grandfather. Other Harry Partch, other composers working at that time in the experimental tradition. And within a year or so, I was starting to plow through a movement of Charles Ives' first sonata, and getting to know some other folks in Spokane that were into new and avant-garde music, and soon starting to put on concerts and happenings and multimedia events at the local museum. And I don't know, it just kept it up, because of my interest and because of that first encounter. I've gotten to work with some of the most incredible musicians, major composers of our time. I can't imagine, my life as a musician without my own personal encounters with John Cage and Christian Wolff and Helmut Lachenmann and Steve Reich and even Olivier Messiaen. This to me, meeting these composers and working with them taught me that music is a living thing. That it's composed by people who either were alive or still are alive, and they're people just like you and me. So that's how I got started.
With that collaboration and work together with the composers, I imagine that you are part of that creative process as well. How does that working relationship look like?
Well, the composer writes the notes. I push the buttons. Um, I've never been in a situation where I've suggested actual uh, compositional work to a composer. I mean, I've commissioned, yes, I've commissioned a few works. Um, had some works written for me, Lee Hyla's Basic Training, for example, and it's wonderful to have the opportunity to be the first to explore. But it's the composer's work. I try to do what the composer says, and then go beyond that and feel my own blood in the performance of the piece. But that is not, to me, substantially different from the way I would approach a Beethoven sonata or Mozart variations, with of course the difference that I can ask the composer questions and have them answered in words, and I can have a composer make suggestions, which is always a fabulous experience. But those are important, but they aren't fundamental. For me, the fundamental attitude is seeing the score and saying, oh, okay, this was a person that wrote this. Now I meet what that person did in my own way. And then if they're alive and I can meet the composer, then we can have an exchange. In a way, it's I feel like the whole process has brought me closer to composers who died before I was born, just because it's easier to see that it's a person there. That's not some sacred text that's come from somewhere. Somebody, Mozart sat down and wrote a big E-flat chord, with his pen. Just like Lachenmann sat down and wrote those 10-note chords at the beginning of Serenade.
We oftentimes hear that students or teachers say that it's too complicated to play new music. Lots of times we don't understand the language. What do you say about that?
Easily Blackwood, the pianist, performed Uhle's second sonata, and one of my teachers once was talking to him about it. It's an enormously difficult, complicated work. She said, how do you learn something like that? It's so difficult, so complicated. He said, I learn it 1 inch at a time. You have to make fewer assumptions than you do in music that you've heard. But I mean, we are piano players, which means we take notation in the classical tradition and bring it to life. We're not in an oral tradition or a teacher-taught memory tradition, like a lot of classical Indian music, say, or folk music. Long history of classical, so-called classical Western European music is funneled through the notation. And that means in playing newer music that you have to look more closely at it. The Crumb Macrocosmos is a great example. I do teach a class in this, in being able to read and decipher new notation and new techniques. But a good composer will put everything you need to know on the page. Sometimes maybe you need to know a little bit more about the history or life of the composer or the environment. But if you look at George Crumb's music, you see these footnotes and asterisks. He tells you exactly how to do everything. If you take that seriously and you're patient with yourself, then you can get started. Then you develop it. Then you say, oh, it sounds different if I pluck the string here or on that end or on this end. Oh, and then it's like voicing a chord. Then you decide. And sometimes you have to kind of come up with solutions. Do I mark certain notes inside the piano? Or do I sit on a higher bench so I can reach inside the piano more easily. You have to make decisions about fingering, how to move your hand around so that it manages all the notes that were there and it sounds the best. But you know, I do that in Bartok and I do it in Beethoven too. And if you're not sure, you make your best guess. I'm a very firm believer in not, quote unquote, listening to the record. When I first did the first book of Crumb Macrocosmos, which has a lot of these inside the piano techniques, it was fairly new back then. I don't know, 5 or 10 years old, not more. And I didn't have anybody to consult except the score, which is all I needed. You know, in the last, you know, decade since then, I figured out ways of doing things that sound better or are easier, or different equipment that I have to bring. But, you know, when I was in 9th grade and learning the Charles Ives First Sonata, there's an E flat, it's a B flat and a G, just F and A. You practice that until the hands know, just like you would practice a Bach fugue. And then when the bar lines disappear and there's a couple pages with no meter and no bar lines, well, you know, a 16th note is still twice as fast as an 8th note. And if you can find a pulse in there that works, great. If you need to pencil in some hints, great. Other than that, it's just an inch at a time.
Well, sometimes we talk about classical music. You have a certain styles. You're talking about Baroque and then classical, romantic, and this and that. Well, come to 20th century, oftentimes we seem to be confused about what to think of that style because they're so different from composers. There's not unified style per se. How do we approach that as a whole?
Well, I like to think of every composer having his or her own style. For that matter, every piece having its own style. Kind of referring to what in certain circles they called the common practice period, where there were approved chords, approved harmonies, and you could get from one to the other in certain ways, and that became more and more adventurous, of course, as time went on. And since 1910, since post-Wagner, Debussy and Schoenberg and Bartók, there's such a much bigger universe of sound. I mean, that's one of my favorite things, is that there are so many options. Now, if I were a composer today, I don't know what I'd do because you can do anything. But you have this whole world of sound, and when I ask students to suggest, you know, what do they want to work on, new music, and they don't know because they haven't heard it, because they haven't heard their friends play it. I say, you know, get onto YouTube and listen to a whole bunch of composers. Listen to 20 composers that are still alive, you know, and not just piano music, just anything. And read notes about it. And when something strikes your fancy, pursue that composer more, see what's written for piano, see who that composer studied with or who his or her students were. What kind of circles they were operating in. If you fall in love with the music of Helmut Lachenmann, maybe you should check out some of Luigi Nono, his teacher. You know, if Charles Ives rings your bell, then check out some Carl Ruggles, who was Ives' great friend. And listen to a bunch of music by that composer, but not the piece that you're going to play. You know, I mean, maybe in casual, you've listened to a dozen pieces. Oh, I remember there was that piano sonata I really liked. But once you pick it, don't listen to it. Don't listen to it. listen to everything else by that composer, and pick up the book, the paper, or the iPad, and look at the notes and find your own voice in it. And if something doesn't make sense, look for footnotes, try things out, see what sounds good, listen to other music by the composer. One of the reasons I loved working with John Cage was in his indeterminate works, he had very little preconception of what he wanted it to sound like. He wanted a new sound come from the performer. And we were talking to him once about a larger piece of his that we were doing with chorus, and described a couple different ways of doing it. And he said, well, let's try it and listen. That's what you have to do as a student also. Put the music up on a music rack, try it and listen. I know I make it sound easy. It's not easy, it's difficult, but reading music is difficult. You know, it's difficult to play for release properly.
So why do we play new music? How important it is?
Well, I'm sympathetic towards the people that are running auditions, because you want to hear what an incoming student can do in a big range of things. So of course you want to hear standard repertoire music that you, the teacher, will know. And like we were talking about, the range of new music is so broad, and there's so many composers and so many people involved with making that music, is the chances are very slim that you're going to hear a piece that you recognize all the notes. You probably, you know, of the 15 or so Stockhausen piano pieces, Klavierstück, I've played one. That I can tell if you're playing the right notes, if you're an auditioning student. But the rest of them, when I'm watching you play, I can tell if you're committed or not. I can tell if you're serious or not. I might not be able to tell if you hit a wrong note, but that's not so important. That can be learned. I can tell if you've got imagination right away. You know, so I'm painted as this new music specialist sometimes. And I disagree with that, because I play plenty of Schubert and Mozart and Defaya. I tend to think of some of the folks in the piano playing business as specialists in dead composers. I feel like they're the specialists, not me. Nothing wrong with being a specialist, but it's not my idea. My idea is I want to play music. I can't imagine wanting to play music and cutting it off at a certain point, saying, you know, I only want to play stuff I already have heard, I already know. I can't imagine not wanting to be part of, not even a community, but a vision of the art of music developing and changing, and not being in a museum. I mean, I've got a record collection. Great, that's not me. Those are all, that's dead. Everything that's come out on a record, that's great, but it's not what I do. If I'm going to play Waldstein Sonata, I'm going to play it like a new piece of music. And I can only do that if I played literally new pieces of music.
What is American music?
Well, I can't answer. Well, American music is music composed by Americans. Now you have to tell me what an American is. Because look at the two people sitting here talking to each other. I'm guessing that one of them can trace grandparents and great-grandparents and a few generations back, still within the continental 48 United States. I'm guessing that after we get back at least a few generations, the other one of us doesn't trace back, but I think we're both American, aren't we?
Absolutely.
So nobody's known what an American really was since Columbus. And he kind of ruined things for everybody that wasn't American at that point, and it hasn't gotten any better since. But so American music is music created by Americans. A composer I work a lot with, who teaches at Harvard, Chaya Chernowan, not born in America. I consider her an American composer. That's that definition is maybe less interesting to me. I have, because of growing up and living in this country, access to quote unquote American composers has been easier for me, and I've tended to get to know more of it. And I was delighted when you suggested that as a jumping off point. Why should we care about American music? Well, there's no reason to care about American music. There's also no reason to care about German music from 200 years ago, unless we care about music. In that case, it doesn't matter if it's American or German or Israeli or Japanese, if it's by Chernowan or Takemitsu or Villalobos. A good friend of mine, Rand Blake, the improvising jazz musician, composer, and we talk about a lot of stuff, and we were talking about beer, and he said, well, what kind of beer do you like? Dark beer, like, there's a blonde, IPA, whatever, all the levels. I said, I like good beer. And I really feel the same about music. I like good music. I don't, if it's American, it's useful to know, to find out more about performing the thing. But I care about music, and I like good music, whether it's by Beethoven or Charles Ives or Hank Williams or Ravi Shankar. If it's good, it's good. And if it's for piano, then maybe I can play some of it.